Welcome. My name is Floyd Mori, and welcome to this part of the Utah Nihon Matsuri, or Japan Festival. We're going to do, we're going to talk a little bit about Utah history today, because during the Utah Matsuri, we normally have a display of historical elements of Japanese Americans in Utah. Having spent much of my life outside of Utah, I always get the question, where are you from? And I'm sure you all get that question, but I get the question and I say, well, I'm from Utah. I was born and raised in Utah. Utah? I mean, there are Japanese Americans in Utah? I think throughout the United States and the world, people don't think Utah is the place that Japanese Americans would be. But my father came here to Utah via working on the railroad from California and ended up in Utah where he got injured and he decided to stay here and farm. So in the early 1900s, my dad became a farmer in Utah and raised 8 kids, moving from 2 or 3 farms throughout Utah. So there are a lot of Mori siblings around. 6 of us still living. My oldest sister just had her 100th birthday. So you can imagine that the Mori family has been around quite a while. And we have some very distinguished panelists today, and we want to talk about Utah. And I want to start off with Ted Nagata. Ted is a very prominent guy here in Salt Lake City. Really, Utah is not where he was born and raised, but Ted, tell us a little bit about how you and your family got to Utah.
Well, let me start off by saying 90% of the incarcerees at Topaz went back to California. And my father stayed in Utah. He was one of the 10% who stayed in Utah. And when you think about it, he lost his home, he lost his business, he lost his cars, he lost his furnishings, and the government told him, oh, we will provide you to store your furnishings and you can pick them up after the war. And this sounded good. So all the Japanese put their furnishings into these warehouses. And what happened was the warehouses got burglarized or ransomed. And there was absolutely nothing left for the Japanese people. So my father was looking at that situation and he found that why not start here in Utah? He doesn't have anything to go back to. And so he began his stay in Utah, and he had some friends here. Saburo Kido, his family was here, and he had 3 children, and we as young people would go up to his house and play with the children. And I might add that Mike Masaoka and his wife visited the Kido house, and we got to meet him. And I might add that Mike Masaoka worked on Japantown at the Sage Farm Market. And he didn't work there long, but he worked there for a while. And anyway, that's how my family got to Utah.
So would you say, how many other families from Topaz stayed here in Utah? Not a
Well,
lot.
I'm just guessing, but I'd say 10% of the families in Topaz stayed in Utah.
Yeah, for those that don't know what Topaz means, Topaz was one of the 10 concentration camps that Japanese Americans were sent to during World War II. And Ted, what area of the United States did these Japanese Americans come from in Topaz?
They all came from the Bay Area. There were a few Hawaiians and a few from LA, but they were very few. The majority came from the Bay
Yeah,
Area.
so Topaz has very close ties to people in San Francisco. When I moved there, I met a lot of people that had spent time in Topaz. So, Irene, how about your family? Tell us a little bit about how you got to Utah and your early time here.
Well, we immigrated. I was born in Japan, but came over as a baby. We immigrated in 1953. And there was a Japanese community in Ogden. But then my father became a miner at the Kennecott copper mines. And then we moved to Japantown when I was around 2. So that's how we got to Utah and to Japantown. And my mom worked at the pagoda as a waitress. And I remember we would go downstairs. Pagoda was down in the basement, right? You had to go downstairs to eat at the pagoda. My mom, and I remember, do any of you remember that wrestler, Crusher Kowalski? He used to love the pagoda, right? And so if we ever were there, my mom liked Crusher Kowalski, and she would always introduce us to Crusher Kowalski. And then we always got the chicken, the pagoda chicken. If there was leftover chicken, we always got it for dinner. I got kind of tired of the chicken after a while because we always got it every night. But that's how we got to Japantown. And neither my mother or my father spoke a lot of English. So Japantown made sense for them.
That's interesting. So your parents came directly from Japan and settled here in Utah.
Yeah, after the war. We're Shin Issei. Yeah.
A pagoda is a good remembrance of anybody that remembers Japantown. I remember as a little kid, my cousins that were here during World War II had their wedding reception there in Pagoda. And I think that was a favorite spot for a lot of Japanese to have celebrations.
Yeah, my brothers worked at Pagoda too. They were dishwashers and did things like that.
I really failed to introduce you properly, Irene. Tell us about what you've been doing most of your life.
Well, okay, most of my life. I am retired now. I retired after 40 years at the University of Utah. Perpetual student. So I started there in my 20s, and while I worked there, I went to school and I got my bachelor's in cultural anthropology. I got my master's in public admin, and I went through a PhD program, and I did everything but the dissertation. So no PhD for me. I'm not going to do the dissertation, but it took me a long time. I'm a late bloomer. It took me a long time. I never wanted to finish a PhD to become a faculty or a professor or anything, but having all that education allowed me to teach, not as a faculty member or tenured or anything, but to teach. And I taught social justice and diversity courses because that's where my interests were. And I did teach about the internment camps, the internment of the Japanese and Japanese Americans in the course of that class. So yeah, I enjoyed teaching. I did a lot of diversity presentations, workshops, and those kind of things, trainings, those kind of things. So I still do trainings now if you want me to. So I have
Irene, I wanted to ask you if you were at Topaz.
We were not. We came in 53. We came to the States after the war. My mother remembers, she told me she remembers the firebombing. She was a teenager. She was in high school, and she remembers the firebombing of Tokyo. She remembers being in high school, and they have to go down to the basement, a bomb shelter, when the bombings were happening they bombed them day and night. So whenever they were being bombed, she would have to go down, her and her classmates would have to go down into the basement for safety.
Did she experience the Nagasaki bomb?
No, we were in Tokyo.
Okay.
We were in Tokyo. So no Hiroshima, no Nagasaki. I was born in Tokyo. We were in Tokyo. Chibakan, just near Tokyo.
So Roland, I'm going to switch over to you. Roland, tell us a little bit about yourself, your history, and how did you get to Utah?
Okay. Well, I was born and raised in Ogden, and I was born in 1954. We kind of got to Ogden in a sort of a strange kind of coincidences, but at the time of the war, some people could voluntarily relocate back inland. So my father had a sister who was married at the time of the war, and they had a connection in Ogden somewhere that would sponsor them. So they moved inland and didn't have to go into camp. Meanwhile, the rest of my father's family was in camp and sent to Jerome, Arkansas. And they were there. In the meantime, my father was in the military, the 442nd. All the things just before Pearl Harbor, he got drafted into the military, of all things. And so at the end of the war, they only had one place to go, which was into Utah, and all collect up as a family, rejoin them as a family in Perry, Utah, Willard and Perry. They worked for the Perry Canning Company in Willard, and they all kind of rendezvoused there and stayed there for a little while. And most of the family decided to move back to the Sacramento area. That's where they were originally from. They were from Florin, just outside of Sacramento. So most of the family moved back to the Sacramento area, but my father and two of his sisters stayed here in Utah. My father just said he was going to work here for a few months, save up some money, and then head back to California. But he never did. He by the time I was in high school, he told me, he said he always thought he was going to move back to California until us kids hit high school, and he realized he's not going back. So he always had that dream of returning, but he never did. So that's how I ended up in Utah.
Roland, I've got to ask you, was your father in the 442nd?
Yes, he was.
He was.
He was in the 442nd because in California he was a truck driver. They worked on a farm, and he drove the fruit truck. Well, they made him a truck driver in the Army, so he learned how to shoot a rifle and drive a truck, and that's what he did in the Army. He drove a truck through Italy and all those places, hauling troops around. So, so that's how we ended up, and I ended up pretty much staying in Utah. Graduated from Weber State.
So, just for the audience, a little geography of Utah. Salt Lake is sort of the northern central part of Utah, and Ogden is a little bit north. What is it, Roland? About 35 miles north?
Yeah.
North of Salt Lake City. And in that Ogden area and even north of that, there were a good number of Japanese families that farmed and worked here and there. So that was one group, and there was actually a Buddhist church. There is a Buddhist church in in Ogden, and then a Buddhist church further north in Syracuse. Is that somewhere up there? Not Syracuse, but Honeyville.
Yeah, there were churches in Honeyville at the time, because there were so many. There were churches in Honeyville, and there was And in fact, I think there was a Syracuse at one time for a little while. So there were quite a few up that way.
That's all basically farming area. Then there's Salt Lake City, and if you go south of Salt Lake City about 2 hours, that's where Topaz was located, sort of central Utah, a little bit out in the desert, huh, Ted? Nice and warm out there in the summertime.
Floyd, I've got to ask you, because there are so many Mormons, Japanese Mormons in your church, how is that? How did that happen?
That's a good question, Ted. I think, like me, I grew up in the country on a farm, and all my friends were Mormons. I went to the LDS church, and as a kid, I just went along with them. And then later, as a teenager, I joined the church. And I think that's the case of a lot of people. But, my parents are Issei. They didn't speak English at all. And in the 60s, there was some missionary work done with the Issei people here in Utah. And that's when my parents joined the church, because there are people that could teach them the gospel in Japanese. So that's how I joined the church. And I think now, you've got really a good spattering of Japanese Buddhists, Japanese Christian church members, and then Japanese LDS members throughout the state of Utah. So it's an interesting mix, and I think all of us get along very well together. Edith Mitko has joined us, and Edith, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you and your family got to Utah.
Okay. On my father's side, my grandpa, Tsunekichi Saito, owned a silk farm in Fukushima, Japan. And after visiting the U.S. to sell his silk, he determined that his family would have a brighter future if they immigrated to California. So my dad arrived in San Francisco at the age of 4 in 1910. On my mother's side, her father was Tojiro Aoki, and he came to the U.S. in 1897, sent by Emperor Meiji to start the first Japanese settlement in America. Mentored by the Archdeacon of the Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, my grandfather became one of the first fully ordained Japanese Christian priests. My grandfather's brother, Gunjiro, came to visit his brother and stayed with the Archdeacon in San Francisco. And Uncle Gunjiro fell in love with the Archdeacon's daughter, Helen, and they announced they were getting married. So I think some of the headlines that maybe were shown prior to the panel talked about how horrible this white girl is wed to a Jap. And you'll appreciate this one, Floyd. The California State Assembly held an emergency session to block this marriage. And so they eventually had to go up the coast, and they had to get married in Seattle. The Archdeacon was so angry that my grandfather, for not stopping this marriage, he sent my grandpa and his family to Utah to convert the Mormons, which, wasn't really successful there. And then my mother, who grew up in Oakland, ended up in Utah. And she always says it was Baishakunin, but knowing my mom, I doubt that anybody could arrange anything for her. But her and my father got married in Oakland on the morning of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. They had a very short honeymoon in Yosemite, and then went to Tanforan and were sent to Topaz. And since mother's family was already in Utah, they were able to get out a little early because Grandma Hacken, she's this wonderful Swiss neighbor, arranged for them to live in her basement and got a job for my father cleaning the lobby at Hotel Utah. And like Roland said, his family wanted to go back to the Bay Area or to Sacramento. My dad wanted to go back. He owned a grocery store. But when he went, all of his friends said, stay in Utah. It's horrible here. The racism was violent. And so thanks to blatant racism by the Episcopal Church, the state of California, and the U.S. government, we lived in Utah, and I'm very proud to say I'm a native Utahn.
So, Edith, you
Yeah.
grew up pretty close to Japantown. Did you get down to Japantown? And for the audience, Salt Lake City actually had a Japantown, and it goes back to about the 1920s, doesn't it, Ted? Or earlier, about the 20s. And the city of Ogden also had a Japantown north of Salt Lake. So Japantowns did well here in the early and mid 90s. So, Edith, can you tell us a little bit about Japantown?
The Japanese Church of Christ was started in 1924. And along that street, we were on the north side. The Salt Lake Buddhist Temple was on the south side. And then east of there was Japantown. And we had like the Mihoya, which had the omanju, Sunrise Fish Market. It had all the wonderful fish. Wada-san had California Market, which was a gift shop, had all the rice and shoyu and everything you needed. And then there was also like the Aloha Cafe and the Pagoda. And even though we were, I was raised on the west side, we didn't go to Japantown except on the weekend. And we really looked forward to Sunday at church. And I didn't understand how comforting that was until I went to Hawaii and I saw these Japanese people on the sidewalk. And I thought, oh, this is neat. But that's how I felt going to church. You know, they say that Sunday morning is the most, what is it? Separated day of the week by ethnicity, because everybody likes to go to their congregation. And it was also nice because the Buddhists were right across the street. I can remember many of the Issei sitting in our Christian chapel with their Buddhist rosaries. And I'd ask Mother about that. And she says, that's fine, Edie, that's fine. I didn't really participate in Obon until I was an adult, but the Japanese Christian Church had in the early 50s, and Ted, you can correct me, but I'd read that in the early 50s and 60s, the Japanese Christian Church had about 180 children and youth attending the church. So we had a very active JCC, which was middle school, CYF, which was high school, and YAs, which were young adults. And that's where I remember Ted from. I think Irene was much too young when she started there. But we started the Oriental Festival in 1952. And that was a fundraiser, but also to introduce the mainly Caucasian or white community to Japanese culture. And that's where I learned how to do odori. And I thought I was a very excellent Japanese dancer, but I was always amazed at the tiny, tiny Issei women who would dress us. And literally with those obis, they'd have one foot on my hip and the other lady would have her foot on my hip, and they just pull that OB so tight. But, you know, it was awesome. And I just loved being able to learn about the Japanese culture through church, through the Buddhists, through the Christians, and then the Oriental Festival, seeing all the ladies cook, getting to dance, listen to the different musicians, and then eventually having to help cook.
So, Ted, you have a little bit of relationship to Japantown, even though you're an import. What's your memories of Japantown?
Well, the new Japantown does not have commerce. In other words, they don't have a place to go eat or shop or buy appliances, but they do have icons of the old Japan and historical signs and manhole covers and lighting and benches. And for a Hakujin to be walking through Japantown today, I think they will have a very good sense of what Japantown is today.
Now,
As far as my involvement with Japantown is, I could go there to get a haircut or get my shoes shined,
Yeah.
and I could buy a tire or take my hot rod to the Uptown gas station, and I have a lot of good memories of Japantown because everybody there looked like me, and I didn't feel ostracized. But anyway, it was.
so Ted, did your wife have anything to do with Japantown?
Oh yeah, she was her father ran the fish market, which was probably the most popular market in town. And so she knew everything about anybody. And
You know, my dad, we lived way, way out in the country in those days. 15, 20 miles is a long ways away. He'd come in for a haircut every month or so, and I'd tag along with him. So I got my taste of Japantown as a little kid, roaming around those stores and sitting in that barbershop. And it was a highlight of my young life, was to go to Japantown. Now, Roland, Ogden had a Japantown. Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah. Down there along 25th Street and through some of the other, through some of the connecting streets, there were a lot of Japanese-owned businesses that had formed there. There was, there was the original location of the Ogden Buddhist Church was there on Lincoln Avenue, just off 25th. And my aunt, one of my dad's sisters that stayed, she and her husband ran a grocery store on 25th Street there. And so we were always down there. As a kid, I was always down there because my dad helped on the weekends. He would work and cut the meat in the butcher area and kind of do work for him one couple days a week. But there were quite a few restaurants, few hotels. My wife's family, they had on her father's side, Al Kubota's father ran a little hotel tap room there, and so yeah, there is quite a place. Raymond Uno, many of you may know, he's a retired judge here in the Valley. He grew up there on that street. So
Who ran the barber shop?
Let's see. There were a couple of barber shops down there. Let's see. One was run by a woman. I believe her name was Minnie Ogata, and then there was another barber shop, and I don't remember the proprietor of that one.
I understand a woman by the name of Masaoka had a barber shop.
Yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe I'm starting to rub some cobwebs off.
Who was his son, or who was her son?
Yeah, wasn't he? You'll have to prompt me, Floyd.
He played a little basketball. So Wat Misaka
Yeah, that's right. Wat Misaka was there. Yep.
born there. Wat Misaka became the first person of color to be drafted into the NBA after he had a stellar career at the University of Utah and at Weber State. There's Wat right there, number 21. He played for the New York Knicks and was eventually let go. And when he was let go, he was offered a job by the Harlem Globetrotters, which he decided he didn't want to do. And he came back to Utah, got an engineering degree at the University of Utah, and was a mainstay here in Utah until he just passed away just a year ago.
Yeah.
I have very good memories of him as a little child. Our family used to gather around the radio. No TVs in those days. We'd gather around the radio and listen to the University of Utah basketball games and cheer for Wat. And I think most Japanese families in Salt Lake would do the same because he became a big hero to us here in Utah. Somebody mentioned the word.
He took a trip to Topaz to visit the people in Topaz. And then I wanted to ask Roland, was Japantown located on 25th Street?
Yeah, it wasn't, it wasn't sort of designated as Japantown. It was just, that's where a lot of businesses had located. So there were a lot of businesses that were all connecting there, but that's where it was, along 25th Street and then down Grant and Lincoln Avenue. There were a lot of these businesses that had located there.
And 25th Street was known for its vice.
Right. 25th Street connects to the Union
Was that
Station.
not true?
Yeah, it connects to the Union Station. So with the railroad comes, the transient traffic and all the problems that come along with it. So there was a prominent red light district down there. There are many bars. When I would sit around at my aunt's grocery store reading comic books, a lot of drunks and people like that would stagger into the store and they'd have to throw them out and crazy things like that. And, so it was a kind of high crime district. My uncle, my aunt's husband, he was killed in a robbery there at the station, at the store in 62, excuse me. He was killed in a robbery there at the store in 1962.
Are you related to Dean Hirabayashi?
Yes.
Oh,
Dean's grandmother is my aunt.
It was his father that was murdered.
No, it was his grandfather. Yeah.
Oh, grandfather.
Yeah.
Okay.
So had a question from the audience about who went to Japantown. Well, with the fish market and sashimi and stuff like that, I think most of the customers in Japantown were probably Japanese in those days. What do you remember, Irene? You lived down that way.
I don't remember seeing a lot of Hakujins in Japantown. Mostly Japanese. That's what I remember. I don't remember seeing a lot of non-Japanese there. I was young though. I think we moved when I was 7, but we were still close. So we lived in Whitmore Court, right across the street from the Salt Lake Temple. We lived in it was a house that was converted into apartments. We lived on a top floor, and beneath us lived an older couple. And my little brother was born when we lived in that house. My little brother Stephen. I remember that. But I remember mostly Japanese, and I remember we would all walk to school. We'd go to Lafayette Elementary. It's gone. It's now the LDS Conference Center. And so we would have to walk past, we would walk past this place with big cement walls and gates. And I would ask my brother, what is that place? What is that place? And it wasn't until I was in junior high that I found out that was the temple grounds. That's how isolated we were in Japantown, right? You were either Buddhist or you went to the Japanese Church of Christ. We went to the Japanese Church of Christ. And so it was pretty isolating in a good way. When going to school, it was all the kids from Japantown went to school, so you didn't feel out of place. But I remember when we actually moved, we moved to the west side of town because that's where you could live. They wouldn't let you live anywhere else. And I was 9. I was in the 3rd grade, and my younger brother and I, on our first day of school, we went to school, elementary school. I was in 3rd grade. He was in kindergarten, I think. The first thing I heard when we stepped on the playground was, "Hey, we've got some chinks at our school." And so there were 3 things I knew. So this is how unusual it was, right? To see any non-Japanese. And then at my school, to see any Asians at all. That I knew that chink was a derogatory word for Chinese. I knew I wasn't Chinese, but I knew they were talking about us, me and my little brother. So that's how, I just felt like very safe and very like the norm until we moved quite a bit of ways. But we always, every Sunday, like Edie said, we went to church every Sunday. That was our place. And I was in the JCC. I was in junior high. I was in the JCC. Yeah.
I might add, we used to drive up from Ogden into Japantown to get supplies, groceries, things like that from when I was a kid. We'd usually come up about once a month and we'd buy some things because the supply of things wasn't that abundant in Ogden. So Japanese goods. So Dad would drive us up about once a month.
Now, Irene, and a couple of you mentioned a little bit about the issue of racism, which is a very current issue today. Can you recall back in the good old days of Japantown and when you were kids, did you experience racism and bigotry that you would say was bad for you? Any of you? Edith, what did you?
I grew up on the west side, and there was one Chinese girl in my elementary school and then me. But if I suffered from any discrimination, it was kind of reverse discrimination because my older brother and older sister went before me. And my brother was pretty big and a football player, very popular and very active socially. And then my sister was the perfect Japanese daughter. She played the piano, the organ at church, and she got straight A's. So when I came, I felt like, I guess they call it the imposter syndrome. No matter what I did, I would get an A because I was Japanese. And at West High, I thought, they'll weed me out here. But no, it was the same. So it was the University of Utah. I felt I'm finally getting a fair grade. But I think because we were on the west side, there were more minorities. There were Puerto Ricans and Blacks and Hispanics and more Japanese at West High, I think, West and South High than any other school. So it was, at least at West and Horace Mann, you were judged by merit. If you're a good student or a good athlete. But I'm sure my brother and sister went through a lot of hazing and discrimination.
So I grew up on the west side too, but we were in a predominantly white LDS neighborhood. And again, my first experience, right, being called a chink. And that was where I experienced more discrimination. I think I was in junior high, and I went outside to get the newspaper. See, my parents didn't speak English, and they were immigrants, and were low income. My dad was a miner and in the Kennecott mines, and so we were more isolated, I think, because of that reason. My parents couldn't interact in like the school system or anything like that. But I remember getting the paper one morning and I saw something weird in the front lawn, and I went to go look, and someone had carved the word Jap out of our lawn.
Wow.
Yeah, and I'm like, we've been living there for a little while, like 4 years, and I thought, did they just notice did they just notice? What was that all about?
Wow.
The model minority stereotype that you're talking about, Edie, I faced that too. I wasn't a great student, but because my parents didn't speak English and they weren't involved, I was never considered going to be successful. I was told in high school that I should get a job, not go to college, get a job, and help my poor immigrant parents out.
Wow. What high school did you go to?
I went to West High.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, but
Oh
see,
my gosh.
this is that intersection of other identities, being that
Yeah.
we're poor, we're low income
Kid.
immigrants, and
Wow.
and I told them, I said, I think if I went to college, I could help my parents out better. That's what I said.
Absolutely.
Kid, you have something to say.
I want to tell you about my experience with prejudice. It was 1958 when me and my wife got married. And we couldn't find a place to stay because most people didn't want Japanese living in their apartments. And finally, we found a place. And we spent a day and a half moving our furnishings, our bed, our washer and dryer. And finally, I said to my wife, golly, it's sure nice to find a place in Salt Lake City. And then my landlord came up to me and said, I'm sorry, but the neighbors don't want you here. So we had to spend another day and a half moving our things out. And even today, well, 10 years ago, people had to ask neighbors on both sides of the house, would you mind if a Japanese moved in here? And that was only 10 years ago. But today, that is not happening.
I was going to ask you, what do you feel today compared to then? Roland, do you have any feelings about that?
Yeah, well, we can go to school. We can go to any college we want. And and there is definitely less pressure on the Japanese than there were 10 years ago. And I think the country is growing up, especially with the Black Lives Matter.
Roland, how about you?
Well, I think it has always been there's always been a kind of underlying undercurrent of prejudice here in Utah because there aren't a lot of Japanese. We have been over the years been more of a novelty in a lot of ways, but the negative side of it rears its ugly head every once in a while. Our numbers aren't that large. When you look in California, and Floyd, you've got that experience in California when Asians become a large enough majority that they begin to exert political power, then you see, real resistance, some real fear gets created out of that. And that's the, and even today in today's world, because of China's economic dominance, you're seeing a lot of fear and a lot of backlash out of that. So there's kind of this, it's something that's always ready to snap. there's a tension that will always be ready to snap. Growing up, it wasn't, I always got all those same names called, always got asked which side did my dad fight on in the war, things like that. And but we kind of made it through, sort of flying under the radar a lot. But I think now today there's new tensions, and no matter how comfortable we might seem, there's always a little tension there that could snap and change. And we've seen that this year. Just over the last year, we've seen this change in the way people perceive Asians.
Yes, Ted.
I just want to say that there has been a lot of prejudice against Asian Americans, not only in the last few years, but for 100 years before today. And I use as an example the 1882 Exclusion Act of the Chinese. I mean, because people felt that they worked for nothing and the economy would go down and their wages would be decreased because of their working for such low wages. But well, I forgot what I was going to say, but there has been a lot of prejudice way before Pearl Harbor, way before.
Yes.
That,
I think
the picture of Promontory Point, there was no Chinese in that picture, although all of the Chinese worked for the railroad. In fact, more Chinese worked for the railroad than the white men, and they only got paid half white men were paid, and they did all the dangerous jobs. And yet when it comes to the finish of the railroad, the Chinese were not even invited.
yes, there were some. When I started first grade in 1945, and one incident I remember very clearly was out of my class, the first birthday party that came along. I was the only one that was not invited to that birthday party. So, things like that happened right after the war, and to a degree since then, and even today. Edith, you talk about siblings. I'm the seventh out of 8, and all of my older brothers and sisters were model students. And
They still are.
and they preceded me, and so for me, it was like you, Edith. It was much easier for me when I got to junior high school. I was asked to be on this and that, not because I knew anything, but because I was Selma's brother.
Right.
Or so that was helpful to me. But then later on, I learned in high school that a couple young women that I wanted to date, and we were very good friends. Socially, they would never go out on a date with me, and I later found out that it was because I was Japanese. Their parents would not let them date me. So that kind of racism did occur, remnants of the war. And I think it still remains today as we see some hate occur here in Utah. I mentioned Mike, or Ted mentioned Mike Mazoka. So, we go back in history, and there are some very prominent Japanese Americans that, even with the barriers that were faced during that time, became very important and prominent people. Mike Masaoka was one of those, and as Ted mentioned, worked in Japantown, was a scholar at the University of Utah, a debater, and as many people know, became the national, at that time, I think he was the national secretary for the Japanese American Citizens League. Yes, Wat Misaka was another one that we mentioned. Wat did play for the University of Utah. That was a question that was asked, was that the years when they won the NIT and NCAA, that's the team that Wat played on with Arnie Farron, Vern Gardner. These were some real all-American type basketball players in those days, and he was often mentioned. Another name was mentioned, Ray Uno. Tell us about Ray Uno.
Well, I don't want to talk about Ray, but Daigoro Hashimoto was a very prominent man, and he was the father of Dr. Ed Hashimoto. And if Kennecott was hiring people like Chinese and Koreans and Japanese people, they didn't want to go one by one. They wanted 50 at a time. And Daigoro was a labor agent, and he arranged for these people to be hired by Kennecott and mines and people who needed workers. And so as a labor agent, he was a very prominent man. And then he built that house on 12th East, I believe, and it's still there. And anyway, he's a
Whoops, Ted froze.
Yeah.
and he would sleep during the day, and he would achieve his goals by hook and crook like that. He was a very prominent man, and he was the only man Japanese to drill an oil well, and he helped establish the Tracy Collins Bank, and he was a very prominent person.
Roland, do you tell us about Ray Uno?
Yeah, I don't know. Ray, I've known him for a long, long time. He was a prominent attorney here in Salt Lake for many, many years. And then he ran for a judgeship back in the days when judgeships were contested elections. And he ran for judge, and he's served as a judge in Utah here for, I don't know how many years, probably, 20, 30 years. And then retired, and he's remained active in Japantown activities and the efforts to keep it going. So yeah, he's been a force here in the Salt Lake area for many, many decades.
And he's like you, Floyd. He was National JACL president.
Oh, that's right.
And he marched in that 1964, that Pettus Bridge. Anyway, he was there.
I'm old. That's what it is. I'm old.
Floyd,
Yes.
you asked us about prominent Japanese, but what I remember the most growing up was that I went to Dr. Toyota, my mom and my sister and I. My father and brother went to Dr. Hashimoto. We had a Japanese accountant. Judge was our attorney if we needed anybody. We went to Japanese dentists. We went to Japanese auto repair. Dad went to a Japanese barber, and it was like the Japanese community really supported each other always, and like you said, we were divided by Christianity, Buddhism, and the LDS Church, but they're very cohesive. I worked with all of the Asian communities when I was director of Asian Affairs, and the Japanese really are so supportive of each other, and they work together, and we have essentially JCL, but all of the other Asian communities, they have several, and their population is smaller than ours. But, like the Filipinos, when I started the Asian office, they had 3 Filipino organizations, and before long there were 6. And when we have the Chinese things for the New Year, there's several different. And I always appreciated that the Japanese were very, very cohesive and supportive. And so I see, like Dr. Toyota, I just thought she was my hero, but I thought that all girls went to a female doctor. I was appalled when I found out my Caucasian girlfriends went to white men doctors. Whoa.
Some of you might know the name Sen Nishiyama. Sen Nishiyama became a right-hand person for the founder and creator of Sony. And Sen he was born and raised here in Salt Lake, but he couldn't get a job when he graduated from college, so he went to Japan, and he could speak good English, and helped Mr. Morita start his business there. Another one that I recall is a doctor by the name of Lindy Kumagai. And Lindy became the head of the medical department at University of California, Davis. And I had his son as one of my interns once, and he always used to talk about how his dad and my brother were very, very good friends in the good old days. So they're Utah, although many of us stayed here and came back here, Utah has been the birthplace of many very prominent Japanese Americans that had an impact, not just in Utah, but throughout the country.
Can I say something about Sen Nishiyama?
Sure.
He was known because he could translate the Japanese language at a real time, and nobody else could do that. They would have to stop and figure out what he said, but he could say it as the guy was speaking, and that was really something.
Simultaneous translation, and he was the one that translated for the Japanese the moon landing. When the United States landed on the moon, he was the one that broadcast that to Japan. Any other elements anybody wants to add to our discussion today?
I have a comment that I shouldn't make, probably get in trouble for this, but when you talk about discrimination, Mahatma Gandhi said, if you want to change the world, start with yourself. And my sister and I were, in the civil rights demonstrations when we were in high school and college. And most of my life, just like Irene, we've been involved with equity, discrimination, the systemic racism in all of our society. But how many times have you seen the Japanese or Asians side by side with the blacks in the demonstrations, side by side with the Hispanics, side by side with the Islam or Muslims? I think that we haven't been as visible or as vocal in helping the diverse communities as as we could be. And I think that we should make the effort to be more inclusive and helpful. I know, Floyd, you've always been involved with it, and like I said, Irene, but I think that we could, as a community, Asian community, do what we expect our allies to do for us, to stand up for us when they're being attacked or we're being attacked. We need to act as we would want to be treated. So,
And
Very, very good, Edith. Yes, Irene.
it's, you know, one of the things is that Asians, including Chinese and Japanese, have been involved in the 60s and 70s. And currently it's just that we are invisible to the dominant society. We really are. It's interesting. You're either hyper visual, you know, as you're, you know, you brought the COVID flu here, or you're ruining our auto business here, or we're invisible. I remember dropping my girlfriend off, who is Japanese American, and at Trax, and I said, "Oh, it's kind of dark, and I'm worried about leaving you here. You want me to stay?" And she goes, "Nobody sees me." Nobody sees me. Because we're Asian, right? And that model minority stereotype works against us. You know, it's not a good stereotype.
No.
They use us against other people of color.
Right.
And so there's that tension. It's called triangulation. They use Asians against other people of color, saying, look how great they are. Why can't you be like them? And so that there's tension there.
Mm-hmm.
Dominant society also says, piece of pie, here's your slice. You guys fight over it. All you fight over this little teeny piece of pie that we're going to give you, but we're really not going to give you, right? We get crumbs of the cake. So I'm going to say that we're there, but the media doesn't pay attention to us. They don't pay attention to the Asians because we're supposed to be the docile, don't rock the boat kind of people.
In commenting about that, Irene, I am very hopeful with this new administration back in Washington, D.C., where we see more Asian Americans taking responsible positions, and at least the president himself speaking out relative to this anti-Asian hate that has been going on in the United States. So I think we're seeing some change. We're seeing something happen here in this country. One question that we had was, what happened to Japantown? Ted, can you tell us what happened to Japantown?
The Salt Palace.
They're trying to revive the Japan.
It froze again.
There.
So back in the 60s and 70s, the city wanted to redevelop parts of the city, as I recall. And one of their projects was to build a convention center. And that happened to be the area, Japantown happened to be the area where they planned to build that Japantown. At that time, there was really not a lot of opposition, not a lot of discussion about it. They just built it. So the place where Japan's commerce used to be sits a nice, large convention center called the Salt Palace. And that's where Japantown went to, here in Salt Lake City.
But I must say, they really have focused on getting icons of Japan and the way it was and the way it is today, because it's more westernized than U.S. is.
Yes, I think Ted is part of a group that has been working to redesign what's left of Japantown, and we are seeing some very positive things that will be there as planned by the city and county of Salt Lake. So we'll see some more reminders of what Japantown used to be. Any closing remarks? We've come to the time where we should be closing. Irene, anything you'd like to say?
Well, the other thing about the Salt Palace was that it was home to the Utah Jazz. They were our first, Utah Stars. It was our first national basketball team, and we needed to build an arena for it. And so the Salt Palace was built for that as well. It was an arena for the Utah Stars. I don't know if anybody remembers them, but I do remember that. I miss Japantown. Sure wish it was there. I miss the variety of foods and things you could get there. I miss the feeling of belonging. I don't know if anything Japantown was big, and they're looking at a block, right? They're looking at a block. Japantown was big, from 2nd South to North Temple, from 4th West to Main or State Street, and now we've got a block.
Not even a block.
Yeah.
A street.
Yeah, a street. Yeah.
Roland, any closing remarks you have?
Well, maybe I'll close. My closing remark will be maybe touching on a question that I just saw pop in here about how to get involved with this redesign of Japantown question. And so I just want to say that what's happened at this point is the city's redevelopment agency has created a plan, a vision, and now it's going to be up to it'll eventually end up being part of the community's role to create some sort of organization structure that can do fundraising, can advise on art and design aspects of what happens. The two remaining private property owners left there are the Japanese Church of Christ and the Salt Lake Buddhist Temple. So they're all going to be looking at what their options are. So that side will be reside in there. But I think there's going to be some future activities, opportunities to create some formal structures that will be recognized by the city in terms of how it implements the plan and at what speed the plan gets implemented.
Ted, any closing remarks?
Yeah, I want to expand on what Rolly said. None of the improvements have been funded. So it's up to the Japanese people and the community. If they want to see this Japantown come to be, they've got to pay for the improvements.
Wow.
And the RDA has given us $100,000 to have GSBS design the project, and they've done an excellent job. I mean, they've gone to San Francisco, San Jose, and Denver, and got all the costs for implementing it. And I think they've done an excellent job.
Thank you, Ted. Edie.
Well, this is to Roland. In the 60s, Mr. Komatsu used to bring his projector and show us Japanese movies with English subtitles. And my mother loved them, and my husband, even though he's Caucasian, loved them. And it was a precursor to our COVID-19 binge watching of K-dramas. So you've got to bring some more of those back, because those were a lot of fun. And like Irene, I miss that part of Japan.
I've had a lot of people tell me we should start something like that again.
Yes. And somebody had commented about the Kawakamis down in American Fork. Whoever that was, please know that Mary Kamakami is just the pillar of Utah, and she is healthy. And I think, how old is she? Like 107
this year.
100 and what?
7.
107. But she is just delightful. I just so admire Mary. She's she's one of my mom's friends. So anyway, thank you, Floyd and Roland and Ted and Irene. It's just fun. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll make the one last pitch here. Next month is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And we've said a little bit about us being a little timid. We are planning to do an event at the City and County Building on May 22nd, involving as many of the Asian Pacific American communities as we can, to celebrate and to explain to Utah that we are here and we are going to be a part of this society, and we're going to make some changes also. So please put that on your calendar, you who are watching and looking. In fact, we're having a meeting at my house in an hour to begin planning that program. So May 22nd, Asian Pacific Heritage Month for Utah, 2021. Again, thank you to all the panelists for your insight. I think all of us have been around basically post-war time and seen a lot of changes in the community in many, many different aspects, not just Japantown, but in many aspects. And for the most part, I think there's been progress here in Utah. The community has moved forward. Individuals have moved forward. We now have a senator, or not a U.S. senator, but we have a state senator, Japanese American. We have a Chinese American, a state representative. The Attorney General of Utah is Asian. So if we thought about this a few years ago, that would have been out of the realm. So we're making progress, but we have a long way to go. And again, we appreciate those that have tuned in to listen. And if you want to know more about Utah, talk to Ted and Edie and Roland and Irene. They've got a lot of wisdom to share with you. So thank you, and we'll turn it off for tonight. Thank you very much.
Thanks.